Out on the brutal, unforgiving edge of the American frontier, a single act of mercy could cost you everything. For Sarah Blackwood, a widow living in the vast, silent emptiness of the Wyoming Territory, that act came in the form of a half-frozen Comanche boy, found shivering at her door during a world-ending blizzard. She chose compassion over fear, a decision that seemed simple in the warmth of her hearth. But days later, her lonely cabin was surrounded, not by wolves, not by the law, but by a silent sea of 100 Comanche warriors. Their faces were stone, their intentions unknown. This is the story of what happened next, a tale of courage that proves the greatest standoffs aren't fought with guns, but with the strength of the human heart. The world beyond Sarah Blackwood's cabin had vanished. It wasn't a gradual fading, but a violent erasure scrubbed from existence by a blizzard that roared out of the north with the fury of a vengeful god. For 2 days the wind had been a constant scream, a physical presence that battered the log walls and forced fine crystalline powder through the tiniest cracks in the doorframe. The snow wasn't falling so much as it was moving horizontally, a blinding white torrent that made the 10 feet from her door to the woodpile a perilous expedition. Sarah, a woman whose features had been shaped more by hardship than by years, stoked the fire. Her husband, Robert, had built this hearth with stones he'd pulled from the creek bed himself. Strong, solid, and dependable, just like he had been. It had been 2 years since the accident, a spooked horse, a broken fence line, a lonely death on the prairie he'd loved. Now the cabin, once a symbol of their shared dream, was her fortress and her prison. The silence he left behind had been deafening at first, but she had learned to fill it with the rhythms of survival, the chop of the axe, the bubble of the stew pot, the scrape of her needle on worn denim. But this storm was different. It carried a deeper, more profound isolation. It scoured the landscape clean, leaving nothing but the howl of the wind and the shudder of the logs. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, as the weak afternoon light surrendered to a premature grey dusk, she heard it. It was not the wind. It was a sound so faint, so utterly alien in the symphony of the storm, that she first dismissed it as a phantom of her solitude. A thin, rhythmic tapping. It came again, a desperate, frantic scratching at the heavy oak door. Her heart leaped into her throat. No traveller in their right mind would be out in this. A wolf, perhaps, driven mad by hunger. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight a meagre comfort. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft thud, as if a body had slumped against the door. Sarah stood, frozen, her breath misting in the cabin's chilly air. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to let the storm claim whatever was outside. The frontier was a harsh teacher, and its primary lesson was self-preservation. Compassion was a luxury, a dangerous indulgence that could get you killed. Robert had taught her that. But he had also taught her strength. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she moved to the door. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy iron bar securing it. The wind caught the door the moment the latch was free, throwing it open with a deafening crash and blasting the cabin with a tidal wave of snow and ice-cold air. The fire bucked and hissed, and the lantern on the table flickered wildly. And there, half buried in the fresh drift that had instantly formed on her doorstep, was a child. It was a boy no older than 9 or 10. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his dark hair was matted with ice. He was clad in buckskin leggings and a thin tunic pitifully inadequate for the blizzard's assault. He was unconscious, his face a pale bluish grey, a dusting of frost clinging to his eyelashes. A small unstrung bow was clutched in one frozen hand. Sarah's eyes widened. He was Comanche. For a heartbeat, all the stories she'd ever heard rushed through her mind. Tales from freighters in Redemption Creek, whispers from nervous homesteaders. Stories of raids of violence, of an unbridgeable chasm between her world and his. The local sentiment fanned by men like the powerful rancher Bartholomew Thorne was that the only good Comanche was a dead one. To bring one into her home was not just foolish, it was treason in the eyes of her neighbors. They would call her a sympathizer, or worse. They would say she had invited the devil to her hearth, but as she looked down at the small, fragile form, she didn't see a warrior or a threat. She saw a child stolen from his mother by the storm. His chest barely moved. He was dying. In that moment, a war raged within her, the cold logic of survival against the fierce, unbidden surge of humanity. She thought of Robert, of the child they had never had the chance to have. She thought of the crushing loneliness that was her constant companion. To let this boy die on her doorstep would be to let a part of her own soul freeze solid. With a grunt of effort against the raging wind, she slammed the door shut, barring it once more against the white fury. Then she knelt and gently, carefully scooped the boy into her arms. He was terrifyingly light, a bundle of chilled bones and stiff buckskin. She carried him to the hearth, laying him down on the bear-skin rug Robert had treasured. For better or for worse, she had made her choice. The storm outside had an enemy, and inside Sarah Blackwood had a purpose. The boy lay like a porcelain doll, beautiful and terrifyingly still. Sarah worked with a frantic, focused energy born of a deep-seated instinct to nurture and protect. She stripped away the frozen, stiff buckskin, her fingers aching as they made contact with his icy skin. His flesh was mottled and waxy, the telltale signs of severe frostbite darkening his fingers and toes. Using snow she'd gathered from the bucket by the door, she began to rub his limbs, the friction a desperate attempt to coax life back into them. It was a harsh remedy, one she'd heard trappers talk about, fighting frost with frost, before slowly introducing warmth. For what felt like hours, she worked under the flickering lantern light, her world shrinking to the small body on the bearskin rug. She brewed a thin broth of salted venison, and when he finally stirred with a low, guttural moan, she propped his head up and gently spooned the warm liquid between his cracked lips. He coughed and sputtered, but he swallowed. It was the first victory. She wrapped him in her thickest wool blankets, positioning him close to the fire, but not so close that the heat would shock his system. She sat with him through the night, the blizzard still shrieking its protest outside. Every so often his eyes would flicker open. They were dark and deep, and in them she saw a fear so profound it silenced her own. He was a cornered animal, wounded and bewildered, finding himself in the den of a potential predator. He said nothing, made no sound other than the shivering that racked his small frame. By morning, the blizzard had broken. An eerie, muffled silence fell over the land, the sun a pale, hazy disk in a white sky. The boy was awake, propped up on one elbow, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a wary curiosity. "Water?" Sarah asked softly, holding up a tin cup. She moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her hands visible. The boy stared at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the offering. With a hesitant motion, he reached out a bandaged hand. She had wrapped his worst frostbite in strips of clean linen and took the cup. His gaze never left hers as he drank. Their days fell into a silent, unspoken routine. Communication was a pantomime of gestures and intent. She would point to the stew pot and then to her mouth, and he would nod. He would point to his wrappings, his young face tight with pain, and she would gently clean and redress the wounds. She learned that his name, or something like it, was a soft two-syllable sound she couldn't replicate, so in the privacy of her own mind, she began to call him Little Hawk for the fierce, unbroken spirit she saw in his eyes. He was a quiet patient, stoic and observant. He watched how she kneaded bread, how she mended her worn dress, how she checked the loads in Robert's old rifle that leaned against the wall. His eyes lingered on the rifle, a flicker of something, distrust perhaps, or recognition in their depths. One afternoon, a week after his arrival, the pain seemed to ebb, and a spark of youthful energy returned. He was sitting by the fire, examining the small, intricate carvings on his bow, which Sarah had saved. He looked up at her, then pointed to himself. "Little Hawk," she said softly, pointing at him. It was a guess and offering. He frowned, not in anger, but in concentration. He pointed to his chest again, and this time he spoke his real name. It was fluid and guttural, a name born of the wind and the plains. He repeated it twice. Sarah tried to mimic it, her tongue fumbling the unfamiliar sounds. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the boy's lips for the first time. It was a breakthrough. He then pointed at her. "Sarah," she said, touching her own chest. "My name is Sarah." He tried to say it. "Sarah." It came out the sound soft and hesitant. In that moment, the fragile bridge between them was strengthened. He was no longer just a Comanche boy, he was a person. And she was no longer just a white woman, a potential enemy. She was Sarah. Later that day, he gestured towards the door, a question in his eyes. The world outside was a brilliant, blinding expanse of white under a sharp blue sky. Sarah understood. He wanted to go home. She felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a mix of relief and a strange, unwelcome sense of loss. The silence was about to return. She nodded and helped him into a spare coat of Robert's, the sleeves ridiculously long, the shoulders slumped. She wrapped his feet in burlap sacks over the linen bandages, a crude but effective insulation against the snow. As she opened the door, the clean, cold air flooded the cabin. The boy looked out at the vast, snow-covered plains, his expression solemn. He took a few steps, his gaze sweeping the horizon, searching for a landmark, for a sign of his people. He turned back to her. His face held a gravity far beyond his years. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of acknowledgement of respect. Then he turned and began to walk, his small figure a dark speck against the endless white. He didn't look back. Sarah watched until he was swallowed by the horizon, a strange emptiness settling in the cabin behind her. The silence was back, heavier than before. She had done the right thing, she told herself. She had saved a life. It was over. But as she stood in the doorway, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air crept down her spine. An unsettling premonition whispered that this was not the end. It was merely the beginning. The days that followed were filled with a profound and unsettling quiet. The absence of the boy left a void in the cabin that was larger than his small frame should have allowed. Sarah found herself listening for his soft footsteps, for the sound of his breathing as he slept by the fire. The rhythms of her solitude, once a comfort, now felt hollow. The world outside was thawing the brilliant snow cover, shrinking daily, revealing the muddy, dormant earth beneath. It was a time of renewal, but Sarah felt only a sense of foreboding, a strange tightening in her gut that she couldn't shake. She was running low on flour and salt necessities that required a trip to Redemption Creek. She dreaded it. The town was a 10-mile ride, a collection of false-fronted buildings, huddled along a muddy track populated by people whose faces had become tight and suspicious since Robert's death. They saw her as an oddity, the widow Blackwood who chose to live alone, out in the wilderness, instead of seeking the safety of the community or finding a new husband. The most powerful voice in that community belonged to Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne owned the sprawling Triple T ranch that choked the valley, and what he didn't own he controlled. He was a man carved from granite and grievance, his fortune built on ruthless ambition and a deep, abiding hatred for the Comanche. Years ago, his first wife and son had been killed in a raid, a tragedy that had curdled his soul into permanent bitterness. He saw the world in stark terms, civilization and savagery his, and not his. Any grey area was a sign of weakness. Sarah saddled her mare Bess with a sense of unease. As she rode towards town, the landscape felt different, watched. She scanned the ridges and the distant stands of pine, but saw nothing but the slow circling of a hawk. Still the feeling persisted. Redemption Creek was just as she remembered. Mud-caked wagons, tethered horses, flicking their tails at buzzing flies, and the wary eyes of men who paused their conversations as she rode down the main street. She tied Bess in front of the general store and walked in the bell above the door, announcing her arrival with a cheerful jangle that felt entirely out of place. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a balding man with a perpetually worried expression, gave her a curt nod. Mrs. Blackwood. Storm treat you all right? It was a rough one, William, she said, handing him her list. But the cabin held. As Henderson gathered her supplies, the door swung open, and the air in the store seemed to grow colder. Bartholomew Thorne stepped inside, flanked by two of his ranch hands. Thorne was a large man, his bulk contained in a finely tailored but practical coat. His face was a mask of stern authority, his greying sideburns immaculately trimmed. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept the room and settled on Sarah. Blackwood. He grunted his voice, a low rumble. It wasn't a greeting so much as an acknowledgement of her existence, like noticing a piece of furniture. Mr. Thorne? Sarah replied, her voice even. She refused to be intimidated by him, a stance that she knew irritated him to no end. Thorne leaned against the counter, his presence seeming to suck the air from the small store. Heard a rumor the other day. He began, his tone deceptively casual. He was talking to Henderson, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah. My man Finn Cutler was out tracking a lost steer up near your territory after the thaw. Found some interesting tracks. Sarah's blood ran cold. Finn Cutler was Thorne's top man, a tracker of unnerving skill and zero compassion. He was a human predator. Henderson stammered, Is that so, Mr. Thorne? Indeed. Thorne continued, his icy gaze unwavering from Sarah. Tracks of a small unshod pony, and moccasins, a child's Cutler reckoned, headed east away from the mountains, away from your direction, Blackwood. Funny thing for a Comanche brat to be doing way out there alone after a blizzard. Sarah's face remained a placid mask, a skill she had perfected over years of frontier poker games with Robert. Inside her heart hammered against her ribs. She met Thorne's stare directly. The wilderness is full of strange things, Mr. Thorne. I'm sure your man has better things to do than follow the tracks of children. A cruel smile touched Thorne's lips. Oh, he does. He's following them now. You see, a lone Comanche child usually means a war party isn't far behind. They might be looking for him. And we wouldn't want a war party getting any ideas now, would we? We wouldn't want them thinking any of our good, God-fearing folk are hospitable. The threat was veiled, but it hung in the air as thick as smoke. He knew, or he suspected, which was just as dangerous. He was warning her, marking her. He was painting a target on her back in front of the whole town. Sarah paid Henderson for her supplies, her movements deliberate and calm. She would not give Thorne the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She packed the flour and salt into her saddlebags, her mind racing. Cutler was out there. He would find the boy's trail leading not away, but to her cabin. He would backtrack. He would know. As she mounted, Bess Thorne stepped out of the store. "Be careful out there alone, widow," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "The land has a way of swallowing up those who don't respect the natural order of things." The ride home was a torment of anxiety. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition. It was a certainty. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. She had saved a boy's life, an act of simple humanity. But in the harsh calculus of Bartholomew Thorne's world, she had committed a crime, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that judgment was coming. She just never imagined the form it would take. The next few days passed in a haze of hypervigilance. Sarah slept little, starting at every creak of the cabin, her hand never far from Robert's rifle. She expected Thorne's men. She imagined Finn Cutler appearing at her door, his cold eyes missing nothing. She envisioned being dragged into Redemption Creek, branded a traitor, her home burned to the ground. Every snap of a twig was a horseman, every shadow a threat. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long golden fingers across the plains when she first saw the dust. It was a faint plume on the eastern horizon, far too large for a single rider or a rancher's wagon. She climbed the small knoll behind her cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She shielded her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a posse. It was an army. Riders. Dozens of them moving with a fluid, unified purpose that spoke of immense discipline. They were not the haphazard cluster of a rancher's crew. They moved like a river flowing over the contours of the land. As they drew closer, the details became terrifyingly clear. They were warriors, their faces grim and painted for purpose, their hair adorned with feathers that fluttered in the breeze. They carried lances and bows, and the afternoon sun glinted off the occasional rifle barrel. They were Comanche. Sarah scrambled down from the knoll, her mind reeling. This was it. Thorne was right. The boy was a scout, a lure. They had come to finish what the blizzard started, to wipe her off the map. She bolted the cabin door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely slide the heavy iron bar into place. She grabbed the rifle, its stock smooth and familiar in her panicked grip, and rushed to the small window. They did not ride like a war party. There were no whoops, no chaotic charge. They approached with a solemn, unnerving silence, their ponies' hooves a soft, rhythmic drumming on the prairie grass. They fanned out, forming a wide, perfect semicircle around her cabin, 100 strong at least. Each warrior sat astride his horse, a stoic statue, their collective gaze fixed on her small, lonely home. They were close enough now that she could see the detail in their leather shields, the intensity in their dark eyes. But they made no move to attack. They just sat and they watched. The silence was more terrifying than any war cry. It was a heavy, expectant silence, thick with unspoken meaning. An hour passed. Then another. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The warriors remained unmoving, their silhouettes stark against the dying light. Sarah's initial terror began to curdle into a raw, exhausting confusion. If they meant to kill her, why wait? If they meant to burn her out, why not ride in with torches? This was something else. A psychological game, a test of nerve. As twilight bled into dusk, 4 riders detached from the main group and trotted forward. They stopped about 50 yards from her door. One of them, a man of imposing stature, with streaks of grey in his long braided hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from ancient stone, dismounted. He wore a magnificent eagle feather headdress that denoted a position of great authority, a war chief. He held up an empty hand, a universal sign of peace. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of conflict. It could be a trick, but the waiting, the silence, the sheer disciplined power on display, it didn't feel like a prelude to a simple raid. Her hand trembled on the rifle. Robert's voice echoed in her memory, a litany of warnings about the Comanche. But another memory pushed through the face of a small, frightened boy sipping broth by her fire. The boy she had called Little Hawk. Taking a breath that felt like it was tearing her lungs, she made a decision. She leaned the rifle against the wall, a deliberate, visible act. Then, with her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her breastbone, she unbarred the door and stepped outside. She stood on her porch, her hands empty at her sides, bathed in the cool light of the rising moon. The air was still and cold. The chief watched her, his expression unreadable. He took a few steps forward. Then, from behind him, one of the other riders dismounted. It was the boy. He was no longer clad in Robert's oversized coat, but in fine new buckskins, decorated with intricate beadwork. He looked healthier, stronger. He walked forward and stood beside the chief. His eyes met Sarah's across the moonlit yard. The chief spoke his voice, deep and resonant, the words in his own tongue, utterly incomprehensible to Sarah. He gestured to the boy, then to her, then swept his hand to encompass the silent 100 warriors who watched them. The boy then looked at Sarah, and for the first time he spoke to her in English. His accent was thick, the words clearly learned and practiced, but the meaning was unmistakable. "He is Stone Eagle," the boy said, nodding toward the chief. "He is my father." Sarah's legs felt weak. The boy she had saved from the blizzard was not just any child. He was the son of the war chief. "My father says," the boy continued, his young voice carrying with profound gravity in the night air, "that you gave him back his heart. He says that the debt is great." The chief Stone Eagle then stepped forward and laid something on the ground. He unwrapped a thick hide to reveal a magnificent buffalo robe tanned to the softness of velvet and painted with symbols of the sun and the eagle. Beside it, he placed a brace of plump wild turkeys and a slab of dried venison. It was not a payment. It was a gift of honor. Sarah stared, speechless. The 100 warriors were not a threat. They were an honor guard. They had not come to take her life. They had come to thank her for saving the life of their future chief. The terror that had held her captive for days finally broke, replaced by a wave of disbelief, so profound it almost brought her to her knees. Stone Eagle looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the warrior. She saw the eyes of a father. He gave a single, solemn nod. It was a nod of respect, of gratitude, of a bond forged in the heart of a blizzard between two worlds that were never supposed to touch. In that silent gesture, Sarah Blackwood understood that her life and the delicate peace of this entire valley had just become infinitely more complicated. The Comanche departed, as they had arrived, in silence. As the sun rose, they melted back into the eastern horizon, leaving behind only the magnificent gifts on Sarah's porch and the churned earth where 100 horses had stood vigil. The encounter had left Sarah feeling as if she'd woken from a powerful dream, the reality of it, both awe-inspiring and terrifying. She had unwittingly forged a connection with Stone Eagle, a man whispered about in Redemption Creek with fear and hatred. The buffalo robe felt as heavy as a king's crown, a symbol of a dangerous, unsought alliance. Her premonition of coming judgment had been right, but she had mistaken its source. The true storm was not the Comanche. It was the reaction of her own people. 2 days later, Finn Cutler rode up to her cabin. He didn't approach with the silent reverence of the warriors, but with the swaggering confidence of a predator. He was a lean, wiry man, with pale, watchful eyes and a face weathered into a permanent sneer. He reined in his horse a few yards from her porch, his gaze sweeping over her cabin, missing nothing. His eyes lingered for a moment on the ground, reading the story of the 100 horses with an expert's clarity. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice slick and devoid of warmth. "Quite a bit of company you've had." "Just the wind," Sarah replied coolly, not rising to the bait. She stood on her porch, her arms crossed, projecting an air of calm she didn't feel. Cutler dismounted his movements, lazy but efficient. "The wind doesn't leave the tracks of 100 unshod ponies. Looks like you had a whole party. Funny they didn't seem to do you any harm. Didn't even burn the place down. Almost like you were expecting them." "What do you want, Cutler?" His thin lips twisted into a smile. "Mr. Thorne sent me. He's a man who likes to know what's happening on his land. And 100 Comanche warriors camped on the doorstep of a lone woman is something he wants to know about. He wants to know why they came, and why they left you breathing. Maybe they aren't the savages Mr. Thorne believes them to be." Cutler laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, they're savages, all right. I've seen their work, but they aren't stupid. They don't do anything without a reason. And the reason I found after a little backtracking was the trail of one little brave, a trail that led right to this cabin." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The boy you found in the storm, that wasn't just any stray. That was Stone Eagle's son. You didn't just shelter a Comanche widow. You harbored their royalty." The confirmation hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She had suspected it, but hearing it from Cutler made it chillingly real. She had interfered in the affairs of powerful men on both sides. "I saved a child from freezing to death," Sarah said, her voice hard as steel. "I'd do it again." "Your Christian charity is admirable," Cutler sneered. "But out here it's called treason. Mr. Thorne sees this for what it is. A parley, an alliance. You're consorting with the enemy, Mrs. Blackwood, and he wants a word with you." He gestured back towards the trail. "He's waiting for you in town. I'd advise you not to make him wait long." Cutler mounted his horse and rode off, leaving the threat to hang in the air. Sarah knew she had no choice. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. To run would be impossible. The meeting took place not in the sheriff's office, but in the private study of Bartholomew Thorne's sprawling ranch house, a room of dark wood, polished leather, and the mounted heads of animals staring down with glassy eyes. Thorne sat behind a massive oak desk, a grim magistrate holding court. Cutler stood silently in the corner. Several other prominent ranchers and businessmen from Redemption Creek were present, their faces a mixture of fear and righteous anger. They were Thorne's counsel, his jury. "Mrs. Blackwood," Thorne began, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. "Cutler tells me you've been entertaining 100 of Stone Eagle's butchers at your home." "They came in peace," Sarah stated, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "They came to thank me for saving the chief's son." A rancher named Peterson scoffed. "Thank you. A Comanche thanks you with a knife in the ribs." "They see it as a sign of weakness, woman," another man added. "They're testing our defenses." Thorne held up a hand, silencing them. He leaned forward, his massive frame looming over the desk. "Let me explain the reality of your situation, as your naive compassion seems to have blinded you. Stone Eagle is a cancer on this land. For years we have been trying to push him back to secure this territory for folks like us. We've lost good men. I lost my family to his savagery. What you see as a humanitarian gesture, I see as an act of betrayal. You have given him a reason to believe he can encroach on our lands that he will find a sympathetic ear here. You have shown him a crack in our resolve. I showed a father that not all white people are heartless. Sarah shot back, her voice ringing with defiance. You showed a wolf the location of the sheep pen. Thorne roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The room fell silent. They were not there to thank you. They were there to scout, to see the lay of the land, to see who was living there, to assess our strength. And what did they find? A lone woman, an easy target. By saving that boy, you may have just signed the death warrant for every homesteader in this valley. He was twisting the truth, poisoning the well, turning her act of kindness into a prelude to war. He was using their fear, his own personal tragedy, to fuel their hatred. That war party is out there regrouping, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspirator's tone. They know the boy is safe. Now they will come back for what they really want. Land, cattle, blood. But this time we will be ready. We are forming a volunteer militia. We ride at dawn in 3 days. We are going to find Stone Eagle's winter camp, and we are going to eliminate this threat once and for all, before he eliminates us. Sarah stared at him in horror. You're planning a massacre. I'm planning a preemptive strike. Thorne corrected her, his eyes glittering with a chilling zeal. It's survival, and you, Mrs. Blackwood, are going to help us. You will stay at your cabin. When they inevitably come back to continue their peaceful talks with their new friend, you will signal us. We will be waiting in the ridges. It wasn't a request. It was an order. He wanted to use her as bait. He wanted to turn her home into a trap, her act of mercy into an instrument of slaughter. No. Sarah said the word small but solid. Thorne's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon. I said no. I will not be a party to the murder of women and children. A heavy silence descended on the room. Cutler shifted in the corner, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Thorne's face became a mask of cold fury. You have made your choice, then, he said softly, the quietness of his voice more menacing than his roar. You stand with them against your own people. Remember that, Mrs. Blackwood, when the shooting starts, bullets don't know the difference. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. As Sarah walked out of the ranch house and into the harsh afternoon sun, she knew she was utterly alone, an outcast from her own world. Thorne had declared war not just on the Comanche, but on her. She had 3 days. 3 days before Thorne and his militia rode out to start a fire that would consume the entire valley. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic preparation and suffocating dread. Sarah didn't flee. There was nowhere to run where Thorne's influence or Cutler's tracking skills couldn't reach. More than that, Robert had built that cabin with his own 2 hands. It was her home, the last piece of him she had. She would not surrender it. She felt a grim, unyielding resolve harden within her. She had been caught between 2 implacable forces, and if a stand was to be made, it would be made here on her land. She spent the time securing her small livestock in the sturdy pen, hauling extra water from the creek, and barricading the windows, leaving only small slits to see through. She was under no illusion that she could fight off Thorne's militia, which she estimated would be at least 30 or 40 angry, frightened men, armed to the teeth. Her actions were not about winning a fight. They were about making a statement. This was her line. On the dawn of the 3rd day, a thick, wet snow began to fall, not a blizzard, but a heavy, silent blanket that muffled the world and clung to the pine branches. It was a somber grey morning. As the light grew, Sarah saw them, a dark line of riders cresting the ridge to the west, the direction of Redemption Creek. Thorne's militia. They moved slowly, deliberately, their dark coats stark against the newly white landscape. But as she watched them, Another movement caught her eye. To the east, emerging from a copse of aspen trees, came another group of riders. It was Stone Eagle with the boy at his side, and perhaps 20 of his best warriors. They were not painted for war. They carried a long staff, adorned with white feathers, a symbol of parley. They must have had scouts watching Thorne's movements, and they had come not to fight, but to talk. Or perhaps Sarah thought with a sinking heart they had come to see their new friend, walking straight into Thorne's trap. Her cabin was now the precise point where two worlds were set to collide. Thorne and his men reined in about 200 yards from the cabin, their rifles held ready. Stone Eagle and his warriors halted an equal distance on the opposite side. The snow fell softly on them all, on the frightened ranchers, on the stoic warriors, and on the lone woman standing on her porch rifle held loosely at her side. "Blackwood." Thorne's voice boomed across the clearing, his words sharp in the cold air. "Get inside, this doesn't concern you anymore." Sarah stood her ground. "It concerns me when you plan a slaughter on my land, Thorne." From the other side, the boy's voice, clear and strong, called out, "Sarah, we have come to speak peace." "There's no peace with these devils." A rancher beside Thorne yelled, his voice cracking with fear and anger. Thorne raised his rifle, aiming it not at the warriors but at Sarah's cabin. "Last chance, Blackwood, stand aside. You are protecting murderers." It was then that Stone Eagle urged his horse forward, stopping in the center of the field between the two groups. He raised his empty hand. He spoke, and the boy translated his voice, echoing in the tense silence. "The man with the angry face," the boy called out, translating his father's words. "My father knows you. He says your name is Thorne. He says he remembers another day of snow many years ago." Thorne flinched his face, contorting in a spasm of pain and rage. "Tell him not to speak of that day," he roared. But Stone Eagle continued, his deep voice, calm and steady, the boy dutifully translating. "He says your wagon was broken. Your woman and your son were cold. My father's hunting party found you. They offered you food. They offered you fire." The ranchers in Thorne's posse began to murmur, looking at each other, then at their leader, confusion on their faces. They had only ever heard one side of this story. "Lies!" Thorne screamed, his face purpling. "They attacked us. They killed my Mary, my boy." "He is not lying," a new voice said. Sarah turned. Finn Cutler had ridden up beside Thorne, but his expression was no longer mocking. It was grim, conflicted. "I was a young scout back then, Mr. Thorne. I was there. They offered us food." Thorne stared at Cutler, his face a mask of betrayal. "You snake. You kept your mouth shut all these years. You weren't in a state to listen," Cutler said quietly. "And your money paid well." Stone Eagle spoke again, his voice resonating with a deep sadness, and his son translated. "Another party of white men came. Whiskey traders. They saw us with your family. They thought we were attacking. They started shooting. It was their bullets that struck your woman and child. My father saw it. He tried to draw their fire away from your wagon." The story hung in the snowy air, devastating in its simple, tragic clarity. Thorne's entire life, the hatred that had fueled him, had been built on a lie, a misunderstanding born of fear and prejudice. He had blamed the wrong people. "He lies!" Thorne bellowed, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked wildly around at his men, at Cutler, at the unmoving face of Stone Eagle. His world was collapsing. Sarah saw her chance. "Thorne, listen to him," she yelled. "Look at him! Does that look like the face of a man who would murder a woman and child in cold blood? Or does it look like the face of a man who has carried this same sorrow with him all these years?" Thorne's face was a maelstrom of confusion, grief, and decades of distilled hatred. He saw his men looking at him, their certainty wavering. He saw Cutler, his most trusted man, confirming the story. He saw Sarah, the woman he had threatened, standing against him with nothing but the truth. The foundation of his life was sand, and it was washing away. With a raw, animalistic scream of pure agony, he raised his rifle. He wasn't aiming at Stone Eagle anymore. He was aiming at the source of his current pain, at the woman who had brought this unbearable truth to light. He was aiming at Sarah. But before he could fire, two things happened in quick succession. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't from Thorne's rifle. It was the sharp crack of Finn Cutler's pistol. Thorne's rifle flew from his hands as the bullet tore through the wooden stock, shattering it. At the same moment, two of Stone Eagle's warriors who had dismounted, unnoticed, tackled Thorne from his horse, dragging him down into the snow. The standoff was over. The ranchers, stunned into silence, lowered their weapons. They stared at their fallen leader, then at the Comanche warriors who were now disarming him, not with brutality, but with a quiet, grim efficiency. They looked at Stone Eagle, who watched the proceedings with a profound sadness in his eyes. He had not wanted this victory. Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe, the rifle slipping from her numb fingers. The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks, covering the hate, offering a clean white slate. In the middle of the field, a line had been drawn and crossed, not with blood, but with the devastating power of a long-buried truth. The aftermath was as quiet and surreal as the falling snow. Thorne's militia, leaderless and shaken by the revelation they had witnessed, offered no resistance. Their righteous crusade had dissolved into a shameful misunderstanding. One by one, under the watchful eyes of Stone Eagle's warriors, they turned their horses around and began the long, somber ride back to Redemption Creek, their faces etched with confusion and a dawning sense of guilt. Finn Cutler was the last to leave. He paused his horse near Sarah's porch. "He'll be disgraced," Cutler said, nodding towards Thorne, who was now being bound by the warriors. "The story will get out. The other ranchers will see him for the fanatic he is. His power in this valley is broken." He looked at Sarah, a flicker of something akin to respect in his cold eyes. "You've got more grit than any of them, Mrs. Blackwood. Be careful." With that, he too turned and disappeared into the snow-filled landscape. Stone Eagle approached the porch, the boy at his side. He gestured towards the bound and defeated Thorne. "What will you do with him?" Sarah asked, her voice raspy. The boy translated his father's response. "He will not be harmed. His anger was born of a great wound. We will take him to the place where his family fell. He will see the truth. Then we will release him. His own memory will be his prison." It was a judgment of profound wisdom, far crueler and more just than a quick death. Stone Eagle then looked directly at Sarah, and a rare faint smile touched his lips. His son translated the final words. "My father says you are a woman with a strong heart. He calls you woman who stands between worlds. He says this land is your land, and you will always be safe. His people will honor the line you have drawn." He placed his fist over his heart in a gesture of deep respect. Sarah, feeling an overwhelming wave of emotion, returned the gesture. The boy gave her one last bright smile, the smile of a child free of the burdens of his father, before mounting his pony. The warriors with Thorne as their prisoner turned and rode east, their forms slowly fading into the curtain of falling snow until they were gone. Sarah was alone again. She walked back into her cabin, the silence within its walls no longer feeling like an oppressive emptiness, but like a peaceful sanctuary. She stoked the fire, its warmth chasing away the deep chill that had settled into her bones. On the floor, lay the magnificent buffalo robe, a tangible link to the incredible events that had transpired. In the weeks and months that followed, life changed. Word of what happened spread through the valley like a slow-moving river. Bartholomew Thorne returned to Redemption Creek, a broken man, his authority shattered, his spirit hollowed out. He sold his ranch within the year and moved away a ghost haunted by a truth he could no longer deny. The fear that had once gripped the town began to recede, replaced by a cautious, tentative respect for the unseen people to the east. The stories of Comanche savagery were now tempered by the tale of the widow Blackwood and Stone Eagle's honor. Sarah never saw the chief or his son again, but she felt their presence. Sometimes she would find a brace of fresh game left on her porch in the morning. On another occasion, a stray calf that had wandered off from her small herd mysteriously reappeared in its pen, guided home by unseen hands. Her line, the one she had drawn in the snow, was being honored. She was no longer just the lonely widow in the wilderness. She was a bridge. Her small cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, had become an anchor point for a fragile, unspoken peace. She had faced down a blizzard and saved a child. She had stared into the face of 100 warriors and found not hate but gratitude, and she had confronted the darkness in her own community and held it at bay with the simple, unshakable power of her own convictions. The plains were still vast and the winters still harsh, but Sarah Blackwood no longer felt alone. The echoes of that snowy dawn of courage, truth, and a debt of honor would ripple across the land for generations to come. Sarah Blackwood's story is a powerful reminder that the history of the West wasn't just written by cowboys and outlaws, but by ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. In a world defined by conflict and fear, she chose compassion. When faced with 100 warriors, she didn't see an enemy. She saw the honor of a grateful father. Her courage wasn't in the rifle she held, but in her refusal to let hatred dictate her actions, proving that one person truly can stand between worlds and forge a lasting peace. If this incredible story of bravery and the surprising bonds that can form in the harshest of landscapes moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves tales of the true unsung heroes of the American frontier. And for more stories like this one that uncover the forgotten legends and quiet courage that shaped our history, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.